I'm very happy to have on today Dr. Joshua Little. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you.
Um, Dr. Little has been making the rounds on social media. He has a dissertation that is available on his website, which I will link in the description for this episode, on the marital age of the Prophet's wife Aisha, and yeah, and I'm super happy to have the doctor on today to give us a kind of thorough presentation on Hadith. I mean, we're going to go over a lot of kind of important things, right? What are Hadith? How is the development of Hadith? How is the development and authenticity of Hadith impacted by sectarianism and geography? How did Muslim scholars go about authenticating Hadith? What's the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis? So on and so forth. So this is going to be a very detailed discussion, almost like a class actually, on the history and study of Hadith literature. So again, I'm incredibly grateful for Dr. Joshua Little for giving me so much of his time and agreeing to come on the podcast in this series of how to in Islamic studies. So yeah, without delaying further, actually no, I should probably has. Please tell us a bit about yourself, Doctor.
Sure. Well, where do I begin? I guess I'm Australian, and I grew up in Australia, and I went to university, did my undergrad in Australia, and then I went to the University of Oxford for my master's and then for my PhD. And that's where I really gained a proper sort of focus on Hadith in my research. Up until that point, I was probably split between Quran and Hadith, but I sort of had to make a choice when I got to Oxford, to sort of specialize, and I chose Hadith. So yeah, then I did my thesis. This is the thesis about the marital age of Aisha, that famous Hadith, and in the process, I've also sort of been more and more drawn to the exploration of just Hadith in general, methods for analyzing and reconstructing Hadith, and also, for example, the proto-Sunni tradition of analyzing Hadith, and sort of authenticating Hadith. And so, yeah, that's probably it in a nutshell. I should also say that I listened to Bottled Petrichor, and I've really enjoyed many of the past episodes. So it's sort of an honor, to be here with you.
I appreciate that, and it's an honor for me to have you on. Just kind of before we start, Hadith in universities. I mean, and of course, there's probably no study about this, but people pursuing their master's degree and writing their master's thesis or their doctoral dissertation on Hadith, I don't know, compared to another field like Quranic studies or law. I mean, where does Hadith rank?
Where is Hadith ranked?
I mean, is this something that a lot of people study? Is this? Yes.
I don't think so. I think right now Quranic studies is in a huge boom, right? You do find people who study Hadith, but it's probably not in a boom right now. Sometimes I see people saying that the field is sort of stagnant or stagnating. I'm not sure if that's right. I mean, there are a couple of sort of new, interesting scholars arising, and there are still some great old scholars functioning in the field as well. We'll probably get to that towards the end with the sort of lists of what are the sort of major works in the field and so on. But I would say it's definitely not. Let me put it like this. If you're in biblical studies, you sort of have no hope of reading all the literature. Even now in Quranic studies, it's getting to that point, I would say, where it's very difficult to canvass all of the relevant literature. In Hadith studies, that is still possible. It is still possible, I think, to read most of these sort of major works on a given topic fairly sort of, capably. So that probably gives you a picture. So if you see what I'm saying, like Hadith studies hasn't reached that sort of boom point yet, where it's just sort of like, endless numbers of people. It's still quite a small field. It's still quite probably the individual scholars still have like an outsized influence in the field, compared to probably other fields. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And with that, I think we can just go ahead and get started. Doctor, you can get started with your presentation.
All right. Let me just try and share my screen. And yes. All right. Can you see the slide?
Yeah, I can see. And the slides.
Excellent. All right, great. Well, let's just jump into it. So the first question that we outlined was, what are hadith? So this is a very simple one. I would just say that a hadith is, in a broad sense, an early Islamic report. And so usually they have an isnad, which is the chain of transmission, and also a matn, which is the actual text or content. So typically you'll open up a hadith book or a book that's citing a hadith, a report, and it'll begin with the author will say, I got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from some putative source or narrator. And that's the isnad. And then we have the actual content, the story or the statement or the precedent, whatever it would be, and that's the matn. And so this is just a very simple definition of hadith in the broad sense. There's also a narrower sense of the word hadith, which is, well, actually, you know what? We'll come to that in the next slide, because this is really covered here. So we've covered the broad sense of hadith, but now remember, there's also a narrow sense that we're now going to explore here in the second question, which is, what's the difference, or are hadith different from sīrah and maਗ਼āzī reports and also historical reports? Or what is the difference? And so I think that the differences here are you find differences in terms of genre, form, isnads, authorities, and origin. So firstly, hadith proper. So this is the narrow sense of hadith. So the broad sense is just an early Islamic report, but there's also a narrower sense, which is really picking out doctrinal reports. So these are reports to do with legal doctrine and theological doctrine. And this is sort of a narrower sense of hadith that you also find. So the major hadith collections, for example, the Sunni canon, these are mostly doctrinal hadiths, right? These are, especially legal. These are mostly legal reports. And so this is the first sort of axis here, is genre. Hadith proper, I would say, are mostly doctrinal. They also, in terms of form, they appear both as narratives and also just statements of precedent. Many hadiths aren't actually a story. They're just like a statement about something the Prophet did, or someone's opinion on something. You have a much higher rate of perfect isnads in hadith proper. So this is isnads where every individual sort of met the preceding individual. There's no gap in the isnad where someone transmits from someone else they never met. And a much higher rate also of, for example, hadiths reaching all the way back to the Prophet. Additionally, there's also no sort of like people who are unknown in the isnad. This is like much less, like there's a higher rate of not having isnads where there are like unknown people in the isnad as well. So this is what I mean by a higher rate of perfect isnads. The people, the authorities involved, you have the sort of famous sort of hadith specialists, the muhaddithun. And so these are people like Qatada, like Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, like Abu Ishaq, like Yahya ibn Abi Kathir, Amr ibn Dinar, and Sulaiman al-Amash. And so these are just some of the major, if you open a hadith collection and you look through the isnads, these are the kinds of people who you'll find again and again, right? So these are these recurring authorities that you find, some of the major recurring authorities that you find in hadith proper, in doctrinal reports. And finally, in terms of origin, and here this is sort of according to the ideas of certain sort of modern scholars, this material originated with jurists and with teachers of doctrine. So this is hadith proper. Now, by contrast, we have sort of the sīrah or maਗ਼āzī material. Just to clarify, this is like biographical reports about the Prophet. These are reports about the life and times of the Prophet. And so originally, this material was called maغāzī. Kitab al-Maghāzi was the standard title for a biography of the Prophet, which is really something like, it's they're like battle stories, right? War stories, that sort of thing. But it just becomes a general term for the biography of the Prophet. And but later on, the term sīrah also takes over as a sort of standard title for these kinds of works and these kinds of collections. So I'm just going to say maغāzī from now on, but it's sīrah / maغāzī material. Okay, so in terms of genre, they're biographical. In terms of form, they are mostly narrative. In terms of isnads, there's a much higher rate of imperfect isnads in this material, isnads where there's a missing person, isnads where there's an unknown person, etc. In terms of the authorities, there are some famous hadith specialists, for example, Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, Urwa ibn az-Zubair, but you also have dedicated specialists in maغāzī who are not specialists in hadith proper. There's a difference in the sort of dominant authorities in the different sets of material. So in maغāzī especially, we have Muhammad ibn Ishaq, we have Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi, and we also have Muhammad ibn Sa'ad. And finally, in terms of origin, again, this would be the view of certain scholars. This material originated with stories. And then finally, we just have general historical reports. This is just reports dealing with the general sort of early Islamic history, the history of the caliphate, that sort of thing. The material appears both as narratives and also as lists and chronologies. Again, we probably have a lower rate of perfect isnads in this material. Major authorities are people like Abu Mikhnaf, al-Madaini, al-Tabari, and this material, some of it, the narrative material, a lot of it originates with storytellers on one view, and other material therein, like the lists and chronologies, originates with what we might call analysts, early sort of figures who are writing down sort of chronologies of, the reigns of caliphs and that sort of thing. So what we can see immediately in all of that material is there are recurring differences. Hadith as a whole, the corpus as a whole, it isn't just like an undifferentiated mass. These you can sort of discern sort of subcorpora that have these multiple distinctive characteristics. There's a recurring difference between them in terms of genre, in terms of form, isnads, authorities, and origin. Now there's overlaps, of course, like some of the same authorities appear. Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri appears in doctrinal reports or hadith proper, and also in maغāzī material. But there are other figures who tend to appear in one or the other. So you sort of see the difference. And then you also see the difference in the genre focus. And you also see the difference in, rates of perfect isnads and so on. So there are multiple sort of, features that sort of signify that we have this sort of, there's a bit of discreteness in this material, even though it overlaps, for sure. Okay, so that's the, differences between maغāzī material, hadith proper, and also general historical reports. Did you have any questions or any comments before I move on?
Yes, quickly, and I know you're gonna go over this at some point. Is there another body of literature that hadith? I mean, you were talking about X person meeting Y person, and chains. Is there another body of literature that researchers rely on to determine the death dates and areas where people died? Is there another body of literature that helps us ascertain that information?
Yes. Okay. So there's a slight complication here. Yes, we have sort of the biographical literature, right? So this is like the kutub ar-rijal, or this is the ilm ar-rijal, the sort of works, prosopographical works, works on hadith transmitters, right? So there are all these encyclopedias and collections and so on of all of the people that you find in isnads and who they were and when they lived and when they died and so on and so forth. And so there's a vast literature on this, and there are sort of the famous authors, Al-Dhahabi, for example, Ibn Hajar, for example, and various others. There are useful databases now where you can sort of search all these works and find, whenever you need to find someone, you can find them very easily. That said, one little caveat that's worth mentioning is that, where does this information come from? Where does the where does the death dates come from? Where do the birth dates come from? And so on. Where does the regional provenance come from? It turns out, if you look in the earliest biographical collections, you'll often find very little information. And as you go on, you find more and more information sort of appearing in the collections about the same people. That's interesting. It seems like a lot of information is being inferred from isnads. So in a lot of cases, especially for the earliest figures, what it looks like is that there isn't really an independent memory of these people and their lives and so on. The scholars are looking at where they appear in the isnads, which generation they're in, and then inferring based on that when they would have lived, when they were born, around when they were born and around when they died. And the way that we know that is that we often have conflicting dates that are broadly within the same range, but there's a lot of variation, right? And that's consistent with this, because different people look at the same person in the same position and then make slightly different inferences. See what I'm saying? And so, okay, so this is just a little caveat there, a little sort of insight about the sort of biographical now in the sense of the prosopographical material, the material on the transmitters of hadith. But yes, that.
I'm sorry, did you say that in the early period, people would look at these names and then look at the names and the generation that they were in, and based on that, create an entry?
In many cases, it seems like that is what is happening.
But then wouldn't people
certain information?
So then looking at the entry later on, is that a bit circular? I mean, they're going to look at the entry later on to kind of determine where people were, but that was based on...
Yeah. Okay. Let me first say, the hadith critics are not analyzing hadith using biographical information. So I don't think they're being circular. This is a modern thing. People now have, or maybe I shouldn't say, it's a classical / modern thing. People now look at the hadith, biographical dictionaries and say, oh, so-and-so met so-and-so. Let me look at the isnad. Yep. They're next to each other. Okay, all good. Oh, wait a minute. This guy didn't meet this. This isn't how the hadith critics are doing it. This is Eric Dickinson is the major scholar on this. They virtually never cite considerations like this. People like Al-Bukhari, almost never. Once or twice, very rarely. What they're actually doing is looking at isnads, and then they find, this person is consistently depicted as saying, akhbarani, akhbarana, so-and-so reported to me. So we know that they met, right? So this is, I don't think there is necessarily circularity. I think that people were sort of getting most of the information from isnads. Not always. There are obviously, even in the early period, there are famous people who people knew about and so on. So I'm not saying this for everyone, but in many cases, it's clear that for some people, a lot of information in general is actually being inferred from the isnads. But I don't necessarily think that the hadith critics who are analyzing hadith, the early hadith scholars, they were being circular on this. I think it's only this sort of happens later. Even then, I don't necessarily think it's circular. I think that even if isnads are false, there are patterns to how they're being created. I think the simple explanation is that people are often modeling isnads, even if they're false, on actual relationships, right? Family relationships, master-pupil relationships, and so on, right? And so that being the case, I mean that, so in other words, people are trying to create plausible chains of transmission. That would actually, through via which information could have actually come, right? And so what that means is that I think isnads are evidence for where people lived. If someone is consistently depicted as having transmitted from someone else, and all the people that they depicted as having transmitted from were, Kufan, and then most of the people they depicted as transmitting to are also Kufan, I think it is reasonable to infer, oh, this person was probably Kufan. You see what I'm saying? So I don't actually, when it comes to inferring that kind of, and also approximately when they lived and died, I think that that's probably, not a bad inference. So I don't necessarily think that there's a problem there with information being inferred from isnads. Even if isnads are false, I don't think that isnads are random, if you see what I'm saying. Even if isnads are false, I would say that there's usually a coherent set of relationships overall in general that are being reflected. Not always, of course. There are, sometimes people are depicted, many, especially for the earliest period, this starts to break down a bit. But, where people are depicted as transmitting from people who we can infer they didn't meet and so on. But overall, I don't think that there's a problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And just one more question. So you have these names over here, Muhammad bin Jarir al-Tabari. You have died 310/923. What are those two different numbers?
Yeah, the first one is the Hijri dating, and the second one is basically CE. So yeah, that's just to explain the two dates there.
Understood. Thank you so much.
All right. Let's proceed to the next one. So the next topic or question was sectarianism in Hadith, or more precisely, how is the development and authenticity of Hadith impacted by sectarianism? So the first problem is going to be, let me clarify sectarianism first. Okay, so in early Islamic history, as in most religions, different groups form with different sort of doctrines and different religio-historical narratives, right? So in early Islamic history, the sort of focus of this is the first Islamic civil war, the fitna, the conflict between Uthman, and then he's murdered, and then the true fitna breaks out, and then you have Ali, one faction led by Ali, another faction led by the family of Abu Bakr, Aisha and Talha and Zubair, and another faction led by Muawiyah, and then there's sort of a fourth faction led by Amr in Egypt as well. And then, of course, the Khawarij sort of split from Ali's faction. And so, and some of these sort of splits end up generating over time competing sort of strands, religious traditions, right? The Shi'i tradition obviously emerges from the followers of Ali, and the Khawarij, emerge from a sort of dissident group who split with Ali, and then there are several other traditions that eventually amalgamate into Sunnism as well. The Uthmani tradition, for example. So the Uthmanis were people who said that Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman were legitimate caliphs, but they didn't accept Ali. And so that sort of sect is maybe too strong of a word. That politico-religious perspective or tendency sort of moves to fixation both amongst the Umayyads and also amongst this sort of faction around the family of Abu Bakr, which will end up becoming what we call the Zubayrid faction, for example. Okay, so we have all these competing early groups, and there's differences in doctrine. There's also differences in their point of view on the early history. So why does this matter? What is the sort of predictable effect of these kinds of competing interests in Hadith when these kinds of people are all sort of transmitting Hadith and so on? So the first problem is bias. The problem of bias here is going to be in the selection and preservation of material, right? So if you have a strong perspective on how history happened or how it should have happened, that's predictably going to influence what you select and what you preserve in the material. So I'm not talking here about altering material or fabricating material. This is just about what you sort of take and what you leave, if you see what I'm saying, right? So to give you a sort of simple example of this, there's a sort of corpus of letters that are attributed to Urwa ibn Zubair, who's sort of an important early Medinan figure. We just encountered him earlier as one of the authorities in maģāzī, for example. He's also an authority in Hadith proper. And there are these letters that are transmitted from him, mostly by his student Ibn Shihab Zuhri and also by his son Hisham ibn Urwa. And so these letters, there's been lots of debates about them. Are they authentic? Are they not? The key thing here is probably they either go back to his students, Ibn Shihab Zuhri and Hisham, or they go all the way back to him, right? And I think Sean Anthony gives a good argument in general, based on the content of these hadiths, for why that's the case, right? But I think that it doesn't necessarily go all the way back to Urwa. It's Urwa or it's his immediate students, right? It sort of fits all of their contexts, right? So, okay, so we have these early letters. Now, as it happens, Urwa was a Zubayrid, right? He was the brother of Abdullah ibn Zubair, who was the leader of a faction in the Second Islamic Civil War, right? And so this is a rival faction to the early Shia, for example. And, they sort of claim descent. And in the case of Abdullah, literally, he's the son of Az-Zubair, right? From the family of Abu Bakr. Az-Zubair was the son-in-law of Abu Bakr and one of the leaders of that early faction that lost in the First Civil War, the faction of Aisha, Talha, and Az-Zubair. And they were fighting Ali, right? What I'm getting at, in short, is that the Zubayrids are opposed to Ali, to the faction of Ali, right? And they actually have their roots in people who are fighting against Ali. So the Zubayrids are Uthmani. They accept Abu Bakr, they accept Umar, they accept Uthman, they do not accept Ali. Urwa, however, is operating after the Zubayrids were defeated by the Umayyads. And Urwa is actually having relations with the Umayyads, going to the Umayyad court and so on, right? He's sort of working with the Umayyads. And the Umayyads are also Uthmani. So we have a double Uthmani factor here with Urwa, and also with the same pressures and considerations and interests would presumably be inherited by his son, Hisham, who's also a Zubayrid, and certainly by his student Ibn Shihab Zuhri, who also works for the Umayyads, right? And is also definitely an Uthmani. And so what is, okay, so what's interesting here? What's the relevance of this? In the letters of attributed to Urwa, which probably go back to Ibn Shihab Zuhri and Hisham at least, and even possibly back to Urwa himself, as Sean Anthony points out, Ali is never mentioned. And I'll read you a quote here from Sean Anthony on this. Absence in a corpus can speak volumes as well. Notably excluded from Urwa's letters is any mention of the Prophet's son-in-law Ali ibn Abi Talib and the Hashim clan of Quraysh. So that's the Prophet's family to which Ali belongs. This absence is all the more conspicuous when one considers the prominence accorded to Ali in other accounts of the events narrated by the letters, such as Muhammad's hijrah to Yathrib/Medina and the conquest of Makkah. Given the hostility to Ali, not only of the Zubayrids and the Umayyads, but also of Urwa's maternal relations, all this argues strongly in favor of the letter's authenticity, unquote. So the point here is that the people from whom this material derives are opposed to Ali. Ali is sort of a political rival for them. And in their depictions of all these sort of these accounts from the life of the Prophet in these letters, they totally omit Ali. So this is a clear example of sort of sectarian bias, right? Either Ali didn't have any role in these events, in which case his proponents in the other accounts and the other versions of these stories have inserted him, or in this case, alternatively, what we have is a case of selection. He's just being omitted from all the stories. You see what I'm saying? So it's not exactly that something's being fabricated, something is just being omitted. You see what I'm saying? Now, in this case, in the case of of Ali, it's not so much of a problem because we have a parallel tradition within the overall Islamic tradition that venerates Ali, right? Both the Shiite tradition and also a sort of soft Shiite tendency that ends up being incorporated into the Sunni tradition. So in the case of Ali, we're actually, there are multiple perspectives that are preserved in the material. So we're not sort of flying blind, as it were. But think about sort of the other groups whose perspectives didn't survive. The mushrikun, the munafiqun, sorry, the early sort of figures who were called pagans, in the pagan opponents of the Prophet. There's debate about whether or not they really were pagan, but let's put that aside. The munafiqun, the sort of hypocrites in Medina, Muhammad's followers who were accused of secretly sort of, being opposed to him. The local Jewish tribes. Also, after the Prophet died, all the factions who were defeated in this sort of pan-Arabian war, the sort of so-called sort of wars of apostasy, the Hurub Ridda, that Abu Bakr won. Think about their perspective. It's not preserved. All we have are the depictions of the victors who are hostile to these groups. See what I'm saying? So this is a problem, right? Sort of sectarianism means that, predictably, there's going to be ideologically driven omissions and skewing in the presentation of the events. In other words, a sort of selection and preservation problem, bias and, so the sort of a selection bias. This is the first problem with sectarianism in Hadith. Second problem is sort of stronger, which is that people will, to put it bluntly, people will lie for their cause. And this is a totally ubiquitous. You find this in every ideology, in every ideological community, ever, practically, right? This is a totally sort of normal kind of thing. And there's sort of a famous quote from Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, who was a major early Sunni Hadith critic, one of the founders of Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism. And he famously said, I've not seen the pious, the Salihin, the pious people, I've not seen the pious in any regard being more dishonest than they are in regard to Hadith. Right? This is a famous quote from Yahya. And so even, presumably he's talking about his fellow, Proto-Sunnis here, right? When he's talking about the Salihin. And there are many other reports as well, even of, so in other words, people always recognize that the rival groups, the others, the Zanadiqa and so on, the heretics and so on, they mass fabricate. But what we even have here in the Sunni tradition is a nuanced perspective that recognizes even our own pious people will fabricate Hadith, right? And so, this is a problem, because if even people who are, basically people of every sort of sect are predictably going to alter material in order to, for the sort of the greater good of their sect, right? To accord to their vision of how history was or how history should have been. And we can see concretely that this is happening in Hadith because we have a lot of contradictions in the Hadith corpus, and specifically contradictions that will often line up with sectarian interests, right? So think about, for example, all the conflicting accounts of the first male Muslim convert to Islam, or the Prophet's favorite woman, or who was the first collector of the Quran, who was the scribal author of the treaty at Al-Hudaybiyah, right? Again and again, the conflicting accounts line up with conflicting sectarian interests, Shi'i versus Umayyad versus, whatever. So this is the next problem with sort of sectarianism in Hadith, why this is sort of a problem. So you might say, though, okay, take, for example, the last thing I mentioned, Al-Hudaybiyah. Some accounts say Uthman was the scribe who wrote the treaty. Some accounts say it was Ali. But they all agree on a basic fact, right? what the sectarianism is doing is just altering a key detail, but they agree on a basic idea, right? So, we still know at least that there was this Hudaybiyah event, right? In this regard, the sort of sectarianism and similar kind of ideological motive, analogous kinds of ideological motivations, there's a danger here. The danger is that people engage in polemical borrowing. So a classic example here would be, and this is a sort of Islamic versus non-Islamic example, right? So this is not, we wouldn't really say this is sectarianism. This is more of an interreligious instance, but it illustrates the principle. So there's this, this famous story that the Prophet, when he was young, he went to Syria. He met a monk named Bahira, who sort of recognized that he was a true prophet because of certain signs. And then Bahira warned him about, watch out for your enemies who will try and, kill you or whatever, harm you. There are many different versions of this story, different variants of this, featuring different kinds of people, but the basic idea is the same. We also find this story in early Christian sources, early Syriac sources. There are Syriac Christian sources that discuss, there's a whole tradition, there's a whole Syriac historical tradition discussing Bahira and how he was this heretic who taught Muhammad all of these, heresies and so on. And that's how Islam was created. See, Islam sort of comes out of this heretic monk. Now you might say, well, they disagree on the details. Islamic sources say Bahira recognized Muhammad was the true prophet and sort of basically rubber stamped his prophethood, right? Christians are saying he was an evil heretic who told Muhammad everything he knew, but they both agree. There was this monk called Bahira. There's a core of historical fact here. I mean, this is ludicrous, right? There's no way that the Christians have an independent memory of this obscure monk living in backwater Syria, right, out on the edge of Syria, who spoke to Muhammad, right? It just seems like incredibly implausible. What's much more likely here is that Christians have picked up the story from Muslims and then they've polemically twisted it to accord to their own interests. So they've taken the Islamic story and they've altered it to make it sort of anti-Islamic. You see what I'm saying? So, there's no shared memory here, right? This consensus between the Christian sources and the Muslim sources is a false consensus. This is the product of borrowing and distortion, right? There is no independent memory here. Okay, so this is one example. So the problem here is that what applies here between sort of, interreligiously is also going to apply intersectarianly, right? So, there's a problem here. The fact that people will take a story of a rival sect and then alter it, borrow it and alter it and change it to accord to their own sect's interests, this can sort of create a false consensus, where actually there is no, actual underlying independent memory shared by both. So I thought I'd just mention that as another problem that basically arises from sectarianism. Before I continue, there is actually one other point about sectarianism that might be worth mentioning, which is to do with the Sunni canon. So we have, we have the Sunni Hadith collections, we have the 6 books, the Sahih al-Bukhari and so on, Muslim, Abu Dawud, we have the 6 books. And then we also have sort of a Shi'i canon as well, the works of al-Kulaini and al-Tusi and so on. So, we speak about Sunni Hadith and Shi'i Hadith, right? Okay. We have a Sunni canon and a Shi'i canon. But this is sort of illusory. In a sense, okay, yes, we have the canon of Hadith that was accepted by the Sunni coalition and became the major 6 books for Sunni Muslims. But the material contained in the Sunni canon is actually of diverse ideological and sectarian provenance, right? So you'll find, at least for the maybe like the first 200 years, for that level of the Isnads, you will find many different ideological backgrounds present in the transmitters of it that appear in the Sunni Hadith canon. So you'll find people from, for example, a Qadari background, right? Advocates of free will, Qatada, for example. Or you'll find Uthmanis. I mean, Ibn Shihab Zuhri, for example. You'll find Shia. There's a difference between, Rafd, which is like the word for like more the people who reject Abu Bakr and who reject Umar, for example, and reject Uthman. But then there's also sort of a softer one to Shayy, which is like a strong preference for Ali, but not necessarily a rejection of the first two caliphs, for example. So I should acknowledge that. Nevertheless, there's this whole spectrum of different sort of sectarian backgrounds present in the transmitters. So in other words, what we call the Sunni canon is actually an inheritance from multiple different competing early groups. And you can probably, from an outsider perspective, you can see this in the content. There are what look like just manifestly Shi'i hadiths in the Sunni canon, for example. For example, the Hadith of the cloak be an obvious one. And there are others. So I thought I should acknowledge that there's this interesting nuance in regards to sectarianism and the Sunni canon. That actually, and so an interesting question would be why? What's going on here? I mean, why does the Sunni canon derive from a diverse set of ideological and sectarian interests, right? I mean, what's going on? So one perspective on this would be, and this is a sort of a critical secular kind of perspective, is that what we call the Sunni, what we call the Sunni position didn't exist in the early period. So they had no choice. There was no major early group who accepted all four caliphs and who accepted all of the companions as being collectively reliable. That's one perspective. So the Sunni Hadith critics didn't have a choice, because by the time that they had arisen and their perspective had arisen, this occurred at a secondary stage. So in the end of the 8th century CE, beginning of the 9th century CE. And so they just didn't have a choice. They had to collect hadith deriving from all these figures who weren't Sunni in the sort of full orthodox sense, because no one was Sunni earlier on. That would be one perspective. Another perspective would be the proto-Sunni hadith critics were just really objective. And as long as someone was reliable, they would accept hadith from them, even if they were, Qadari or Shi'i or Khariji. As long as you were respective, they would accept the material. That's another perspective. So they were just extremely neutral, and they didn't hold people's sectarian affiliations against them necessarily, right? As long as they were otherwise reliable. That's another perspective. Another perspective, or maybe a pushback against that, there's a famous quote, I think, from Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, where he basically says that if we rejected all hadith from sectarians and so on, there'd be no hadith left. So one gets the sense from statements like that they sort of didn't have a choice. So to sort of put that in perspective, you remember I mentioned there are these major figures, from whom vast amounts of hadith derive. A lot of those major figures had unorthodox views on different issues, whether they were Uthmani or Qadari or what have you. And so, if the hadith critics wanted to collect and sift all these hadiths, and the major towering figures of the earlier generations from whom so much of the hadith corpus derives, these sort of very sort of famous figures are to varying degrees unorthodox, they sort of didn't have a choice, right? Otherwise, they would lose, a large amount of hadith. I think that's certainly the impression that one gets from those kinds of quotes. In any case, the point there is just that interesting side point. What we call the Sunni hadith corpus is actually of diverse sectarian and ideological provenance, which I think is quite intriguing. There's a nice article by Christopher Melchett on sectaries in the six books, if anyone's interested in sort of looking into this more, where he sort of tabulates all the different sort of sectaries that are in the early in the canon and why. Okay, let's move on to geography. And this is one of my favorite topics in hadith, the question of geography. So how is the development and reliability of hadith impacted by geography? In my opinion, geography is key to understanding early hadith and also early fiqh. Absolutely key. I don't think that you can really properly appreciate what's going on in the early period if you don't understand the geography, the regional traditions that are involved. So just to give maybe like to start with an interesting sort of question. Famously, when it comes to the issue of diet, for example, actually, let me pose this as a question to you, Ashur. What is the general Sunni perspective on eating aquatic or marine animals that are not fish? Have you ever heard anything about this? Any discussions, any debates among Sunnis?
I know there might be a difference of opinion between the Hanafis and other madhabs with regard to shrimp, stuff like this.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So the other schools are okay with it. You can eat non-fish marine life. But the Hanafis are against it. And the Shia are also against it, the Twelvers. So what's going on? Why is it that the Hanafis and the Shia agree on this, have one perspective, then all the other Sunnis have another perspective? What's going on? We'll come back to this. This is sort of going to answer that question. So, okay, so geography. So when we look at the extant, Islamic tradition, Sunni and Shi'i, right? We look at sort of the classical pictures and the classical self-image that they, present. Looking at them, now. What we have is, they have their canonical collections. They have these established theories. Everything is coming for the, for the Shia. Everything is coming from this sequence of imams, most of whom are in Medina. And for the Sunnis, almost everything is coming from the Prophet, right? The authority of the Prophet is on top. Everything should be based on the Quran first, and then on the Sunnah of the Prophet. And there are some other sort of sources of doctrine beneath that. But the Hadith of the Prophet are sort of, at the top. So, okay. So what is there to disagree about this? So here's an analogy. To take the extant classical tradition at face value as providing an accurate picture of what the earlier period was like is sort of like starting with the Gospel of John and then interpreting Gospel of Mark in light of the Gospel of John. If you were to start with the Gospel of John and you interpreted everything in light of that, you would just end up with basically a false picture of what the earlier perspectives were, right? What you want to do is start with the earliest sources and let them sort of speak for themselves, not overlay later, developments and consensus and so on, and classical notions, and impose them on the earlier sources. This is just a basic sort of principle in sort of secular, critical, historical investigation, is that you want to find wherever possible the earliest available sources for this exact reason, right? So if we look at the earliest available sources for hadith and fiqh, what we actually find is quite a different picture than what you would get if you just opened a canonical hadith collection. What we find is there are, first of all, the hadiths that were cited by far the most in the 8th century CE are not hadiths of the Prophet. People are not primarily citing the Prophet. What people are mostly citing are the precedents and the opinions of companions and especially of followers, right? So we have the Prophet, the companions of the Prophet, and the followers of the companions of the Prophet. People are overwhelmingly citing the followers and the companions in the 8th century CE, in the earliest layer of material that we have preserved, right? Or the writings of people like, Abu Yusuf and Ash-Shibani and Malik and Shafi'i, he's responding to all of this negatively, right? But there's a consistent picture that emerges in all of the material. This is the picture. People are mostly not citing hadiths of the Prophet, right? That's just a fact. That's just what you find in the material, right? There's no debate about that. The other thing that's interesting in the material is that it's all regional. What you find described and embodied in the earliest collections is discrete regional traditions of fiqh, of Islamic jurisprudence and hadith, right? And there are five regions, or there are 5 centers within 3 regions, right? So in the Hijaz, we have Makkah and Medina. In Iraq, we have Kufa and Basra. And then we also just have Syria, which is just sort of undifferentiated, right? And so there are 5 major centers. There are 5 major regional traditions of fiqh and hadith in early Islamic history: Makkah, Medina, Kufa, Basra, and Syria. And almost all ilm, almost all Islamic knowledge comes from these 5 centers. Sometimes people will talk about, when people are having arguments or whatever, and they'll appeal to the whole early Islamic society, the whole early Islamic empire, from Spain to, India, right? North India, from Spain to Sind, right? This, how could something have spread so far? How could something, whatever, right? People will make this sort of appeal. This is totally misleading. There is no independent memory or independent tradition to any meaningful degree. Maybe there's 1 or 2, and there is it's debatable, but there's, even just at face value, there's almost nothing in the other regions, right? There is no like robust, independent, Khorasani tradition of hadith going all the way back to the Prophet independently, right? There's like barely anything, right? It's like there's a fraction, even putatively, of hadiths claiming to be that, right? Same for Egypt, same for Spain, same for pretty much every other region. Even just accepting the isnads at face value, like 99% of the material comes from those 5 centers, right? Almost every other region got their hadith and their fiqh and their qira'at and their everything from Iraq, Hijaz, and Syria, mostly from Medina and mostly from Kufa, I would say. Those are like by far the dominant centers within these regions, right? So these are key to understanding early Islamic intellectual history, early hadith, early fiqh. These regional traditions: Makkah, Medina, Kufa, Basra, Syria, right? Before there were madhahib, before there was Hanafi and Shafi and Maliki and Hanbali and so on, there were these regional traditions. So what are the regional traditions? Firstly, we have the Meccan legal tradition. And so some of the notable figures in the tradition, we have Abdul Malik ibn Jurayj, we have Ibn Abi Najih, we have Amr ibn Dinar. but probably the most important figures, the key figures whose opinions are cited most of all. So this is like the heart of the Meccan legal tradition is Ata ibn Abi Rabah, Mujahid ibn Jabr, and Tawus ibn Kaysan. These are all followers. These are all students of Ibn Abbas. However, and Ibn Abbas is also cited as a key authority, but by far the most important early authorities are those followers, right? These followers are the heart of the Meccan legal tradition. Next, we have the Medinan legal tradition. Famously, we have Malik ibn Anas. We also have Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari. We have Rabi'. We have Zuhri. And then we also have the 7 jurists of Medina. And the lists of who the 7 jurists are just changes depending on what source you look at. There's clear, it's just this phrase that, there is no agreement. There's all these different lists. But one of the major figures, for example, or recurring figure would be Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, an important early follower and jurist. And then probably the major follower of the Medinan tradition, the follower who sort of exemplifies and is most cited by the sort of mainstream Medinan legal tradition, would be Abdullah ibn Umar. Of course, there are other followers who are cited, but Ibn Umar is probably the major exemplary figure of the Medinan legal tradition. We also have the Kufan legal tradition. Of course, we have Abu Hanifa. We also have Ibn Abi Layla. We have Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman. And then amongst the sort of followers, we have Sha'abi and Ibrahim an-Nakha'i. And then we have the companions of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So this is people like Alqama ibn Qais. And then finally, the major companion of the Kufan legal tradition would be Ibn Mas'ud himself. Next, we have the Basran legal tradition. This one is less attested. So for the Medinans and for the Kufans, we actually have early collections by proponents or inheritors of those traditions, right? We have the students of Abu Hanifa left us works. Malik has left us works, right? Or his students have, compilations of his material. But we don't have sort of analogous, dedicated, Basran legal compilation, a Basran legal compilation by a major Basran, legal figures and so on, right? It's much harder to get access to that sort of material for the Basrans and for the Syrians and also for the Meccans, right? So we normally have to reconstruct these schools based on what others are saying, right? Or later collections, the Musannaf Hadith collections that sort of preserve a lot of material from these figures. Okay, so the Basran legal tradition, we have Ibn Abi Aruba, we have Qatada, and then we also have these major sort of followers, Ibn Sirin, Hassan, and Ikrimah. And then in terms of some of the important companions who were cited in the Basran legal tradition, we have Anas ibn Malik, and we also have Samura ibn Jundub. And so, but again, it's the followers who are probably the most important, like defining figures for the Basran legal school, right? Their opinions, their precedents. Then we have the Syrian legal tradition. So we famously have Al-Awza'i. We have Zuhri, who moved from Medina to Syria. And then amongst the followers, we have Makhul. We have Abu Idris. We also have a lot of Umayyad caliphs being cited in the Syrian tradition, although interestingly, some of them also show up in the Medinan tradition. And then we have some of the major local Syrian companions who are cited in the Syrian tradition as, authorities for their opinions, or Bada, for example, Abu ad-Darda and Mu'adh. So what's of interest here? I mean, okay, so there are these different sort of, early major regions with their different sort of, genealogies of material and their respective, most frequently cited local authorities. There are local followers who are often cited. There are local companions who are often cited. I mean, why is this of interest? There are differences. There are substantial differences in doctrine between these early regions, right? They all agreed on some things, some basic points, 5 prayers a day, whatever. But when it comes to all the details, you usually have disagreement. And so this, for example, is a quotation attributed to Al-Awza'i. You have similar quotes attributed to other figures like Zuhri. So, it's questionable whether this actually does go back to Al-Awza'i himself or whether it's been projected back to him. Regardless of whether it's, a retrojection or not, I think that it gives quite a nice sort of sense of the kinds of disagreements here. So this is a summary of sort of the highlights of controversial views that regions hold, right? So Al-Awza'i reportedly said, 1 second, sorry, there we go. Rejected, now I've had to sort of, to make this sort of make sense, I've added a little bit of text here in the square brackets just to make it make sense, right? Okay, rejected are the following. Amongst the doctrines of the people of Makkah, their views on temporary marriage and the sale of currency. Amongst the doctrines of the people of Medina, their views on listening to music and the permissibility of anal sex with women. Amongst the doctrines of the people of Syria, their views on determinism and obedience to tyrants. And amongst the doctrines of the people of Kufa, their views on the permissibility of alcoholic date wine and the pre-dawn meal during Ramadan. So what we have here is a list of some of the very famous positions that each regional tradition holds that is rejected by the other regions / by the latest sort of Sunni consensus, if you see what I mean, right? So these are just some examples. You will find if you go through these sort of Musannaf hadith collections, for example, or the early sort of legal sort of writings of people like a Shafi and so on, you'll find constant disagreement on all kinds of issues that's regionally based, right? The dominant stance of each regional tradition will often conflict with another region, right? And okay, so why? Okay, just another point on this. I mean, what's of particular interest here is that all of the regions are citing, in some cases, the same authorities, right? The regions are citing, I mean, they mostly cite their followers and their companions, but they do also cite the Prophet at times, right? But they will cite the Prophet in conflicting ways, right? So the Prophet is invoked. For example, there's a major early legal debate that raged about forced marriage, right? I'm going to sort of simplify. I'm just going to say forced marriage. There are certain sort of caveats and so on about the parameters, but I'm going to simplify, right? So there's a debate about forced marriage. And to put it simply, the Medinan tradition and the Basran tradition are pro-forced marriage, right? But the Kufan tradition and the Meccan tradition are against it. Now, again, there are caveats. I'm just putting it simply, right? So each tradition is citing its local authorities to justify its perspective, but they actually all end up citing the Prophet. So the Prophet is cited both as supporting forced marriage and as opposing forced marriage. Now, of course, what ends up entering the Hadith canon is the Hadith where the Prophet is clearly opposed to it, right? So this is the famous Hadith where he talks about how, virgins have to be asked for their permission in marriage and so on, right? But, and so you would, again, this exemplifies the issue. If you just open the Sunni Hadith canon, right, and you just say, oh, the Prophet said, Prophet came out again, this was his position, done, right? It would totally disguise the massive diversity and the early debates that are going on regionally and these regional traditions. You see what I'm saying? And the other key thing there is that if the Prophet, and also another figure who's often cited with conflicting positions by different regions is Omar as well. And so if they're repeatedly being cited for conflicting positions, it can't be that, it's just, the different position, the different regions have just recorded. Each one has remembered something different genuinely from the Prophet. I mean, they're constantly contradicting each other. So the simple explanation here is that we don't just have regional differences in opinion. These regional, and the regions are sort of in conflict with each other, right? They're like having polemics against each other. They're sort of rivals doctrinally with each other. They are in their debates. They're actually, they are producing false material. Actually, I think we'll come back to this in a moment. Let me just double check. Oh, yes, we are. Okay, we are. Okay, so we'll come back to this. Okay, so then over time, towards the end of the 9th century CE, this sort of journeying in search of hadith and collecting hadith in different regions becomes more and more common. And you have the rise of a group who are called the Ahl al-Hadith or the Ashab al-Hadith, who think that you shouldn't base your doctrine on local tradition, local custom and opinion and things like this, but that everything should be based as much as possible on, well, first of all, the Quran, but then also on hadiths from the Prophet. And where you don't have available hadiths of the Prophet, hadiths of companions, and so on. And this gives rise to the Shafi'i school, for example, and the Hanbali school, for example. And so this basically eclipses regionalism, right? From around the year 800 onwards, there were the sort of regional traditions are sort of eclipsed by this sort of general sort of pan, regional kind of hadith culture, and people are traveling everywhere, and people are just people aren't accepting hadith based on its conformity to their regional tradition. People are now just accepting hadiths as long as they're from the Prophet, and then they're developing these new criteria as long as it has a continuous chain, everyone in the chain is reliable, and so on and so forth, right? This is the rise of proto-Sunni hadith criticism. And eventually, obviously, we have the rise just of a Sunni canon, for example. And so the result of this is a trans-regional hadith corpus. The hadith canon that you open now, if you're looking at Bukhari, you are looking at the hadiths that have been sort of selected from all these different regions, and they've been shorn of their original regional context. You see what I'm saying? So, it's no longer, you don't have any sense anymore that hadiths were bound to regions, reflecting local regional perspectives. Instead, it just appears to be this sort of, just this, it's all just hadiths of the Prophet. We just have here the Sunnah of the Prophet, done and dusted. But actually, if you look earlier, we discover, all this material is divided according to region, right? And each region has its own conflicting positions. And so what you end up having in the Sunni corpus is all of these random different positions from the different regional traditions are represented. So on some issues, one region has won out, all right, and their prophetical hadith is now in the canon. And then on a different issue, another region has won out, and their hadith on this other issue is now in the canon, right? So the canon sort of, if you're just looking from the perspective of the canon, you're going to get a completely false picture of what was actually going on in the early period, right? There isn't just this sort of monolithic, hadiths of the Prophet that are just sort of preserved and that's it. Instead, we have all this sort of everything is regionally divided, and there are conflicting positions in the regions, and they each have their respective conflicting hadiths. Okay, so this is the eclipse of the regional traditions, but they weren't totally eclipsed. So we still have echoes of the regional traditions in the surviving legal schools. So the Hanafi school, for example, is an outgrowth of the Kufan legal tradition. And this has also been argued for the Shia, for example, because the main center of Shiism was actually Kufa, right? And that would explain why the Hanafis and the Shia agree, for example, on the issue of shrimp or, non-fish aquatic marine life, because they're from the same region. They embody the same regional tradition. Whereas the other Sunni schools are embodying effectively the Medinan position on this. Right? So the Maliki school is directly the outgrowth of the Medinan legal tradition. The Abadi school reflects the Basran legal tradition. And then the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis they probably lean Medinan, but they're sort of trans-regional, and they just accept prophetical hadiths and so on, just from all these different regions. But all of them have been sort of hadithified, right? So there's this sort of shift, there's sort of this like traditionalization that occurs where even the sort of the Malikis and the Hanafis end up more and more sort of trying to rationalize their doctrine, which they've actually inherited from the regional traditions, in terms of hadith and especially prophetical hadith over time. But they originate with these regional traditions that aren't mostly citing prophetical hadith. They're mostly citing the precedents of companions, local companions, and local followers, and sometimes just generic local custom as well. Okay, so coming back to the impact of this for hadith and reliability of hadith. I've already sort of touched upon this. The problem here is that these regions are all in conflict, in ideological sort of, doctrinal conflict. And so, they predictably, that would lead to the same kind of things we saw with sectarianism. And we see this concretely. The regions have conflicting ascriptions constantly to similar figures, right? One region will, for their position, will attribute their position to a follower, the major follower or a major companion of the rival tradition, right? And so regions will, so these are sort of like Trojan horse hadiths. A region will cite the authorities of a rival group to justify theirs, and vice versa, right? Or one region will cite a follower, the other region will then cite that follower from a companion with the opposite view, right? So they're sort of trumping the other group, for example. So we can see clearly this sort of ascriptional arms race occurring between them. And we know this is happening. First of all, it's sort of the easiest way to explain all these weird contradictions, where Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab is made to say one thing, then the other region has him transmit what happens to be their position from an earlier authority. What's going on there? Well, the simple explanation is this sort of interregional sort of polemical ascription and so on. But we also just have contradictions. Again, as I said before, the prophet is being cited every which way in conformity with each region. And the same thing goes especially for Omar, for example. I mean, the simple explanation there is people are falsely ascribing things to the prophet based on their competing regional perspective, right? Probably that's a simpler explanation than that the prophet constantly contradicted himself on like every issue, right? Probably the simple explanation here is regional, conflicting ascriptions and so on. So this is the problem of regionalism in hadith, right? Now, even if you don't think that things are being falsely created, right? Still, it's very interesting that in the early period, things are divided according to region. So even if you don't take such a critical view of hadith, I think that regionalism is still a really important lens through which to understand early hadith transmission, and early fiqh, for example. And so this, the key division when it comes to the legal material in early Islamic history is not sect. It's not Sunni, Shi'i, whatever. This is the wrong way of looking at it. The early key division is geographical, regardless of sect. And thus we have, the Hanafis and the Shia agreeing over here versus other Sunnis. Because what that reflects is not a sectarian difference, but a regional difference. So this is really key. And I think one of the most sort of interesting aspects of early Islamic history is this regionalism. One final thing to do with regionalism and the problem of regionalism is the issue of bottleneck. So this is particularly a problem with maģāzī. Most of the material on the life and times of the Prophet comes from Medina. And it comes from, in particular, this set of figures, Al-Waqidi, Ibn Ishaq, Musa ibn Uqba, Az-Zuhri, and Urwa, all of whom were major Medinan figures. Now, Al-Waqidi ended up moving to Baghdad. Ibn Ishaq also ended up moving to Iraq. Az-Zuhri moved to Syria. And so they're disseminating a lot of this biographical material in other regions, but it's all coming from them in Medina, right? So there's a sort of a relatively small group of people from whom most of the biographical material derives, right? It all sort of concentrates in basically one place at one time, that time being, let's say, the first century and a half, the first 150 years of Islamic history. Most of the material is coming out of a circle of people in Medina, basically in the same place at the same time. And so the problem with that is that it makes it hard to know what's independent. Like if we have, the same sort of, idea, like an event or something that's reflected, and there's like multiple independent isnads. But if it's all going back to the same people at the same time at the same place, that's a real danger, right? Because it's not that incredibly means it creates the real possibility that these are not independent accounts. If it's the people who sort of are interacting and know each other, then this is the prime sort of conditions for contamination and for memory distortion. Like people sort of are influencing each other's accounts, or even people are just getting the material from each other, right? They aren't actually independent. We don't actually have independent accounts. One authority comes up with a story, and then it just sort of spreads to the others, right? And so this is a big problem, is that all the material. So this is a why, if you're looking at everything just from the perspective of isnads, this may seem odd. Like, well, there are just all these independent isnads. But once you realize that, at least in this domain, almost all the material goes back to people who are alongside each other in the same place at the same time, it creates a problem. I'm not saying that the people are lying. It's more just that, people just end up sort of influencing each other and so on and so forth. And so this is another problem with geography. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, about how sort of communities will sort of influence each other's memories, and how the sort of memory contamination happens, and this sort of thing, I recommend all the research on oral tradition, communal memory, and so on. There's a really nice summary given by Bart Ehrman in his book Jesus Before the Gospels, on the last sort of century of scholarship to do with that. So this is just a last point on geography, and sort of the problems posed by geography, or generated by geography, in regards to the transmission of hadith and the authenticity of hadith. So now we have the question of, how did Muslim scholars go about authenticating hadith? So there are several different approaches to verifying hadith that you find across early Islamic scholarship. We have the regionalist approach. I don't know if the regionalist is really a standard term. This is just how I'm going to describe it, right? So we have the regionalist approach, the rationalist approach, sectarian approach, and the corroboration-based approach. So firstly, the regionalist approach. So this would be accepting or rejecting hadiths in light of your local custom. So this is, again, there's the Medinan tradition, the Meccan tradition, Kufan, Basran, and so on, right? And so here we have, and the most famous example of this is Imam Malik, right? Malik is a regionalist jurist. He's a partisan for the Medinan tradition, and he will accept or reject hadiths depending on whether or not they cohere with his inherited local custom, right? Which is called amal, or also amr, right? And sometimes the term sunnah is also used in early sources in sort of a similar way, sort of meaning local custom. So here we have a famous example of this. There's this hadith which ends up being canonical. This is later regarded as a sahih hadith, right? This ends up in the canon. This is the hadith where the Prophet actually seemingly comes out against forced marriage, right? The non-virgin, in some versions it's ayim, or in other versions it's thayyib. In this version, I think it's ayim, right? So the non-virgin has more right to herself than her legal guardian, than her wali. And the virgin is asked for permission concerning herself. And her permission can be indicated by her silence, right? So the key thing here is you have to ask women for their consent when you want to arrange a marriage for them, right? Now, there's some of this is a little bit ambiguous, like silence being taken as consent, right? It's a little dubious. But the point is that they can say no. Women have the right to say no, according to this hadith. They can refuse the marriage, right? So that's this hadith, which is transmitted here, that Malik cites in his Muwatta. He cites this hadith. And then Malik says that Al-Qasim ibn Muhammad and Salim ibn Abdullah used to marry off their virgin daughters without consulting them. Right? This is reported from Malik. And then Malik says, that is our custom. Right? That's our custom concerning virgins. So Malik cites a prophetical hadith that is later regarded to be sahih, right? This is a continuous, it's a muttasil, it's continuously transmitted hadith back to the Prophet. It's later regarded to be sahih. He cites this hadith where the Prophet says, is against forced marriage. And then he cites local custom and the precedent of two local followers in Medina. And then he says, that's what we do. So it's clear that he is rejecting this hadith. He cites the hadith, he cites conflicting local custom, and he says, that's what we do. So it's pretty clear, right? And then he repeats this a little bit later on as well, and he adds another follower here, Sulaiman ibn Yasar. And they used to say, so Al-Qasim, Salim, and Sulaiman used to say concerning the virgin, her father can marry her off without her permission, and verily that is legally binding upon her, right? So here we have Malik rejecting a hadith from the Prophet in favor of local custom. What's determining whether or not he accepts a hadith is his local tradition. You see what I'm saying? So this is a sort of a prime example of this sort of regional, what we might call a regionalist approach to hadith, right? To adjudicating between hadith. Next, we have the rationalist approach. Now, there is a bit of a false dichotomy here because the regionalists and the rationalists are sort of the same thing. So what I'm picking out here is just a difference in emphasis, right? The early rationalists and the early regionalists substantially share the same sort of legal theory or epistemology, the same basic approach, but some have a bigger emphasis on local custom. Others have a emphasis on, more like, like rational deduction, like engaging in sort of syllogistic reasoning, inferring, positions and so on. But even here with the rationalists, one of the recurring features here, right? So they say, okay, for a hadith to be accepted, it has to be consistent with the Quran. So they reject hadiths that are inconsistent with the Quran. It has to be consistent with common sense or established knowledge. It has to be consistent with consensus, or it has to be super widely transmitted. Now, what you'll notice in most of these, right, common sense is sort of tracking established, historical knowledge, for example. Consensus, super widely transmitted. All of this is really kind of tracking a similar concept to local custom. The idea, the sort of basic gist shared by all of these is this is something that is generally inherited, right? It has to cohere with what is generally inherited. And if it goes against that, it's probably false. See what I'm saying? It's like, so even though I'm saying we've got the regionalists who are appealing to local custom, the rationalists who are appealing to common sense and consensus and super wide transmission, but there's you can sort of see how there's a similar idea hiding behind all of these, right? And so, so here we have, for example, Abu Yusuf, and he famously is quoted as saying, hadith from the messenger of God and the transmission thereof have greatly multiplied, and what has emerged therefrom is unknown. It is not known to the jurists, nor does it agree with the Quran and the Sunnah. Beware of aberrant hadith. Incumbent upon you is the acceptance of hadith that the majority accept, and that are known to the jurists, and that agree with the Quran and the Sunnah. Draw legal analogies for things on the basis of such hadith. But that which contradicts the Quran is not from the messenger of God, even if it has allegedly come via transmission, right? So this is a classic sort of statement of this sort of rationalist approach, right? Okay, so this is sort of and also the early Mu'tazila have similar ideas. So this is basically, to put it, the regionalist approach. This is especially exemplified by the early, the Proto-Maliki school, and which is coming out of the Medinan tradition, and then the rationalist approach is especially exemplified by the Proto-Hanafiya, and also by coming out of the Kufan legal tradition, and also by for example, the early Mu'tazila, who are coming out of just in general, they come out of Iraq, I suppose. But again, there's a sort of similar basic idea reflected in both the regionalists and the rationalists, right? Okay, next we have the sectarian approach. So this one is pretty straightforward. You reject hadiths if they're transmitted by heretics or by sectaries, people from rival groups, right? Or people, unorthodox sources, unorthodox tradents, and you reject hadiths with unorthodox or sectarian or heretical content. So this is a sort of just a nakedly sectarian approach to hadith. And so we have this famous quote from Ibn Sirin, where he says, they did not used to ask for the isnad, but when the fitna occurred, they said, name for us your tradents. Those who were considered people of sunnah, their hadith would be taken. And those who were considered people of innovation, their hadith would not be taken. And so this is just a nakedly, sectarian approach to analyzing hadith. If it deviates from our orthodoxy, then it's rejected. And finally,
again, what is the
sorry. Go ahead.
What is the when the fitna occurred? What's that fitna?
Oh, okay. This is a sticky issue. Okay, so the dominant classical Sunni interpretation would be that this fitna refers to the first Islamic civil war, right? But the dominant sort of perspective of secular critical scholars is that the fitna here is actually the second fitna, the second Islamic civil war. And so to that end, scholars like Yoimbol and Pavlovich and so on, they will cite, first of all, Ibn Sirin, even though he's not necessarily, whether or not it's genuinely his quote or if it's someone putting it in his mouth, if I say to you, if I was born, or as a small child in World War One, if I actually lived as an adult through World War Two, right? And then I say the war, I'm talking to you and I say, in the war, we both know which war it is. It's not the war that happened ages ago when I was a kid. It's the war that happened most recently when I was an adult. It's the Second World War, right? Now, when people say the war, they almost always mean the Second World War. So the same reasoning is applied here. When he just says the fitna, the most obvious thing that he would be referring to is the one that happened recently when he was an adult, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is that it seems like even some early Sunnis or proto-Sunni scholars interpreted it this way. So, for example, Al-Juzajani, according to Pavlovich, he cites this hadith in the context of the second fitna, right? So that makes it seem like he thinks that this is a reference to the second fitna. We also have one or two, some variants of this hadith that add in a detail saying, oh, in the early period. So that's the first fitna. Well, why are they doing that? If it's just obvious that this is the first fitna, why did you have to add that in? That's consistent with, it's sort of like, methinks this hadith protesteth too much, right? It's like, oh, they're sort of compensating and trying to make it clear. No, it's the first fitna. That implies that people think it's the second fitna, and they're trying to emphasize that it's the first fitna. And finally, and this is sort of the slam dunk, we have other reports that have similar kinds of ideas that just straightforwardly say, the isnad began to be used in the time of al-Mukhtar. That's the second fitna. It's just straightforward, right? So all of that together, probably it's meant to be the second fitna, not the first. The reason why people would want to say it's the first fitna, of course, is that would mean the isnads go back right to the earliest companions, directly after the time of the Prophet. That's the reason why you want to say it's the first fitna. If it's the second fitna, okay, isnads are arising much later on. It's a bit more of a problem, right? There's more time for false material to have proliferated and so on. So this is the debate about that. Anyway, the debate continues, but the consensus of secular scholars, at least, so probably the Sunni consensus is that it's the first fitna in traditional Sunni scholarship, and the consensus of secular scholars is that it's the second fitna. Okay, any other questions about this?
No, thank you.
All right. Go on to, so here we have the corroboration based approach. And so this is the primary method that's used by the proto-Sunni hadith critics. So the proto-Sunni hadith critics are this community of early Sunni scholars who come out of people like Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj and Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi and Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan. And their students are people like Yahya ibn Ma'in and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And then their students are people like al-Bukhari and Muslim, right? So now at that point we recognize, I think, these names, right? These are the people who produce what become the canonical Sunni hadith collections. So we have this community of hadith scholars who are judging hadith, and they're saying this one is sahih, this one is sound, this one is da'if, this one is weak, and so on, right? And they end up producing these hadith collections that become the Sunni canon. So these scholars are their primary method is to sort of try and establish corroboration. But I should acknowledge that they also retain a bit of the sectarian approach. They will reject hadiths that have unorthodox content, just flat out. It's not accepted. And they will also often say, if a transmitter is transmitting hadiths that have overtly unorthodox content, that is a sign of their unreliability. However, they will accept unorthodox tradents as long as they aren't, frequently transmitting hadiths with flagrantly unorthodox content, right? But hadiths that do have unorthodox content, they'll just reject. People who transmit those hadiths, they will reject, at least in principle. Again, things get kind of messy in practice. But the primary, as long as the hadith doesn't have unorthodox content, the hadith critics, the Proto-Sunni hadith critics, will try and establish corroboration of transmitters. And this is how they establish whether or not someone is reliable. So this is an example. This is a famous quote, or anecdote about, Yahya ibn Ma'in. And he says, Ismail ibn Ulayya said to me one day, "How are my hadith?" I said, "You are sound in hadith." Then he said to me, "And how do you know that?" I said to him, "We compared the hadiths of other people with your hadiths. Then we saw that they were sound." Then he said, "Praise be to God." And he, continued saying this for a while. So the point here is that Ibn Ma'in looked at the hadiths of Ibn Ulayya and he compared them with the transmissions of other people. So when Ibn Ulayya transmits from someone, Yahya will see, do other people also transmit the same hadith from the same authority, right? And so by checking, he finds, normally when Ibn Ulayya transmits a hadith from X, you'll find someone else has also transmitted the hadith from X, see? And so Ibn Ulayya is corroborated. He's generally corroborated, and therefore he is reliable, right? So basically, the hadith critics, they would check for the general corroboratedness of tradents, of transmitters of hadith. Tradents who are usually corroborated by other reliable tradents would then be deemed reliable, whereas those who are often uncorroborated or even contradicted by reliable tradents, they would be deemed to be unreliable. And there's also a spectrum, there's generally reliable, generally unreliable. There are also people in the middle, so there's a little bit of a spectrum, but we're putting things simply. Okay, isolated transmissions and additions from reliable tradents are accepted. So if someone is normally corroborated and then that person transmits a hadith no one else has, that's okay, all else being equal, as long as they are generally otherwise corroborated. If they're corroborated in general, then when they're isolated in particular, that's okay, right? This can be accepted. But if you're isolated, if you're transmitting something that no one else has, whether it's a hadith no one else has, or it's an element in a hadith, like some key addition in a hadith that no one else has, and you are not generally corroborated, then that will be rejected. So this, in a nutshell, is the sort of process of corroboration. There are, however, some uncertainties in all this. So one problem is that the actual details and the argumentation for how this process is going on in practice, we have almost nothing. If you look through, if you look at hadith collections, they almost never give you argumentation. Even if you look at other works, like books of, ilal, for example, books on subtle defects in hadith, there's usually what you're just getting is people's judgments. And even when they cite, Ad-Daraqutni, for example, is very good. He'll cite all these different isnad. So he'll actually give you the evidence, right? Which is wonderful. He doesn't give you the reasoning, though. He doesn't tell you why he accepts this one rather than this one, right? He'll say, here's these different transmissions. This version reaches back, to Abu Ubaidah, and this version reaches back to Abu Ubaidah from Ibn Mas'ud, right? And he says, the one that goes back to Ibn Mas'ud, this is the khata, this is the error. And the one that only goes back as far as Abu Ubaidah, his son, this one is the thawab. This is the correct version. Why? He never, always been, in all the time that I have looked at hadith criticism in these works, I don't think I've ever come across an instance where they actually give you the reasoning right? Again and again and again, they give you the conclusion. They don't give you the argument. They don't give you the reasoning. They don't give you the criteria. They just, sometimes at least they'll give you evidence. Often they won't give you evidence. Often you just have a judgment. Sometimes you will find evidence, but you still don't have the method, the reasoning. So all we can do is look at these extremely generic principles and then try and extrapolate what they're doing. But at the end of the day, we just don't know in detail exactly what's going on. So for example, when does a hadith or an isnad count as corroboration for the reliability of a transmitter versus when is it being judged in light of its transmitter? This is unclear. I mean, one hadith I'm looking at, for example, in one instance, Ahmad ibn Hanbal says, everyone who transmitted this hadith is unreliable, right? No reliable person transmitted this hadith, okay? That's why he rejects it. Okay, so the hadith is rejected because it's only transmitted by unreliable people. But then in another instance, we have Yahya ibn Ma'in, and he says, oh, why is so-and-so unreliable? Why is he a filthy liar? Why is he a kadhab khabith? Because he transmits that hadith. So it's like, oh, so do you see what I'm saying? So wait, so are you unreliable because you transmit the hadith, or is the hadith unreliable because it's transmitted by unreliable people? You see what I'm saying? Like it's like very unclear, and there are plenty of times when like it just seems like there's like mystery. Like there sometimes we'll have, oh yes, this is an independent isnad. So we have, this is a mutabi, or this is a shahid, this is some sort of corroborating independent isnad. Other times people will say, oh no, this similarly independent isnad, this is just a khata, this is an error. Even when it's transmitted by someone who's otherwise regarded as thiqa, reliable, right? There are plenty of instances of this. So there's a lot of uncertainty here regarding the actual details, the actual argumentation. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of sort of unresolved questions around exactly how they're doing this, right? Another issue is, the criterion for being corroborated is not that there are independent isnads, right? It isn't like, oh, someone transmits something and other people transmit the same thing. No, that's not the criterion for corroboratedness. The criterion is someone transmits something and other reliable people also transmit it. The way that you establish corroboration or contradictiveness is by appeal to already established reliable people, right? So the question is, well, then what about those people? How is the base set of thiqat, how is the base set of reliable people established as such at the beginning of the analysis? Because almost every statement of principle about how you establish reliability appeals to thiqat, or ma'rufun or mashhurun. It's like appealing to these like famous, great reliable transmitters. But then how are they established as such? So there's this sort of mysterious kind of first stage of hadith criticism that is pretty much undocumented, right? How was this first set established? We don't know. And then the final thing is that it seems like there's also maybe a lot of intuition going on in this. So how exactly does someone know that someone is reliable, right? Like, At-Tabarani will constantly say in his Mu'jam, for example, oh, so-and-so is the only one who transmitted this. This is not transmitted by anyone other than so-and-so. So-and-so was isolated in his transmission of this hadith. How does he know that? Does he have the entire, has he looked at every single hadith ever, right? Maybe there are versions that he's not aware of, right? He's just making these arguments from silence. It's clearly just his impression. It's At-Tabarani's subjective impression of what he has experienced in the material that makes him say nothing else exists. It's only this, right? The same thing seems to be happening with, corroboration. Like, in order for you to be able to establish that someone is actually corroborated, generally speaking, think about how many, like it's just a given transmitter transmits hundreds of hadiths. For every single one, you'd have to collect all of those hadiths, right? And then you'd have to collect every single parallel transmission for every single one of those hadiths that putatively exists in order to then compare, are they generally corroborated in what they transmitted? It would end up being a huge book just for a single tradent. And you'd have to do that for thousands of tradents overall. So it starts to seem like, how exactly then are they doing this? Even if you think that they were able to, El-Bukhari knew, tens of thousands or 100,000 hadiths or whatever, these large numbers, vaguely knowing many hadiths wouldn't actually get you to what I'm describing. You'd actually have to do a proper systematic evaluation of every single transmission, and then, every single co-transmission for every single trading. That's actually something much more than just vaguely knowing lots of hadiths. It seems like what would actually have to be going on here in practice, how the hadith critics are establishing corroboration, probably what's going on here is that they're just relying off memory, right? And this is what Jonathan Brown actually says this. I think that's right. The hadith critics are actually going off their subjective general impression based on their general experience with the hadith corpus. That's probably, I would argue, that's how they establish if someone is corroborated or not in general, is based off a general vague impression or memory of their experience with all the transmissions, right? And so, in other words, there's a kind of role of intuition going on in establishing corroboration. But again, this is sort of uncertain, right? So there's a lot of question marks here about exactly how the proto-Sunni hadith critics are evaluating hadith, but this is, so there's a lot more sort of research to be done here in unpacking all of this. So I've actually recorded a sort of separate short sort of presentation where I go over a specific hadith that was generally regarded to be fabricated, and I sort of explain how the hadith critics are approaching this, and how they're analyzing this hadith, how or why they're rejecting it, and so on. So there's sort of a practical demonstration that you'll be able to find, a link probably below or something. There'll be a link or something that will take you to that sort of supplemental, presentation that gives this sort of concrete example of early sort of proto-Sunni hadith criticism in action. All right, so next we have modern scholars of hadith. What is the range of opinions with regard to the reliability of hadith among modern scholars? So firstly, some general points of agreement. In general, I would say that most scholars are broadly skeptical or cautious towards hadith. Probably, no, not probably, definitely, and as we'll see, I'll give examples of this. Most sort of major specialists in hadith don't accept hadiths at face value, right? In general, the idea is that in any given case, you should be skeptical or not accept a hadith unless you have a positive reason to do so. This sort of general sort of skeptical view is mainstream now. And just to sort of illustrate that, actually, I have a couple of quotes from Harold Motzki, Gregor Schuler, and Andreas Gorka to illustrate this, because people often hold up these figures as being much less sort of skeptical. And so this is sort of like an a fortiori argument. If even Motzki, Schuler, and Gorka are quite skeptical, it sort of shows you how skeptical the field in general must be, right? So, for example, Motzki notes that only very few Western scholars are convinced that the Muslim traditions are generally reliable. That's a general statement from Motzki about the field as a whole. After doing an Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis, and we'll come back to what that is subsequently. So after doing a certain kind of textual reconstruction of a particular hadith, Motzki lamented that, quote, the historical facts that can be extracted from the sources relating a certain event of the Prophet's life are few, unquote. And he further said, quote, the historical biography which will be the outcome of all these source critical efforts will probably only be a very small one, unquote. In another instance, when he reconstructed a hadith that he ended up regarding as actually basically authentic, Motzki said, this result surprises me, and surely the majority of Western hadith scholars, since one cannot generally get this far with the source critical methods presently available, unquote. So being able to actually trace something back all the way back to the life of the Prophet, this is exceptional, according to Motzki. Gorka and Schuler said, the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis only provides information about whether a certain tradition is old, roughly speaking, whether it was already circulated in the 1st century after the Hijrah or not. This kind of tradition, if this kind of tradition does indeed go back to the Prophet or a companion, is a different question, unquote. And then Gurka further stated elsewhere, quote, so far it has not been possible to securely trace back any narrative about the life of Muhammad to a companion of the Prophet, unquote. And then finally, Motzki said, and here, so there was a big debate between Harold Motzki and Herbert Berg about, the reliability of Hadith and the viability of the Isnād-Cum-Matn Analysis and its utility and how far back we can get with it and so on and so forth. Motzki says, and he's responding to Berg here, Berg rightly states that scholars such as Strauss, Motzki, and Schuler, by collecting the extant versions of related Hadith and by examining both the Mutun and the Asanid, try to reconstruct the transmission history of the Hadith in question and to distinguish earlier stages of the texts from later editions. Yet Berg's assumption that in doing so they believe that they have conclusively shown that Hadiths are largely authentic is wrong. I do not believe that. I only assume that many traditions found in the extant compilations were not invented by the compilers, but have a history, including forgeries, which can be retraced to a certain point in time. The main aim of my approach is dating traditions. The fact that, for example, a hadith of the Prophet can be dated to the second half of the 1st/7th century does not mean that it is authentic in the sense that it really goes back to him in the form preserved, or that it reflects accurately what really happened. By dating traditions, conclusions about this type of authenticity will be possible in very rare cases, if ever, unquote. So you can see here how sort of generally cautious or sort of skeptical even Motzki, Schuler, and Gurka are, right? So a general skepticism or caution towards Hadith is currently, you find all across the field. However, there's also, I would say, a general agreement now that we can use the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis to reconstruct earlier versions of Hadith. We can trace Hadiths back to what are called common links, these sort of, common point of origin that is often depicted in the Isnads, and we'll come back to this subsequently. So there's a general agreement now. We can use Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis to reconstruct earlier versions of Hadith and therefore to date Hadiths. And there's also, I would say it's a common view across the field that some authentic data survives in Hadith. I would say that most people agree, or virtually everyone actually agrees, that there is some authentic data that survives in Hadith. The major debate, the major issue is just, how do we identify that? What methods can we use to identify that sort of thing? And we'll come back to that subsequently. But for now, that's sort of just a general overview of, what is sort of the general agreement in the field at the moment. Now, major disagreements. I would say that there are two major disagreements when it comes to the issue of Hadith, authenticity of Hadith, etc. The first one is about the accuracy of gists. So the debate here is, are oral traditions generally in the space of, a generation or two, a few decades, are oral traditions stable, right? Or at least was the early Islamic oral tradition basically a stable oral tradition, such that the basic gists that we can reconstruct, for example, back to people like Urwa ibn Zubair, right, can be accepted. This is the argument of people like Schuler and Gurka. The opposing view, which is the view held by people like Kroner and Horting and Shoemaker, and there are others as well, Christopher Melchert, for example. The other view is that in the case of early Islamic history, we have early rapid mutation, distortion, and transformation of material in an extremely unstable oral tradition. So this is one of the major debates, is can we trust the gist of reports that, for example, we can reconstruct back to early figures like Urwa? That's one big debate, one big disagreement. The other big disagreement would be on the role of the common link. So when we, look at all the isnads, of a given hadith, and we line them all up. They often all converge on a single figure, right? Who's the common link, right? And then the common link transmits to other figures from whom it branches out. So we have partial common links. So hadiths go back to these sort of partial common links, and then all the partial common links will converge on a single common link, right? In the isnads. We'll show diagrams subsequently, and you'll sort of see this sort of clearly. And so the question is, what is the common link? Is the common link someone who has, is just a reporter? They're, accurately passing on, to a certain degree, material from their cited source. Now, everyone agrees that they're paraphrasing, things are being altered, interpolated, and so on. This is generally agreed. But nevertheless, Maॻāzī and Gorka, for example, argue that, we can regard the common link to be a transmitter cum disseminator, right? They are accurately they could be accurately citing what they have heard from their cited source. By contrast, people like Schacht and Joinbol thought that the common link is basically a fabricator, someone who has falsely ascribed what they are transmitting to a preceding set of sources. But even in general, I would say that uncertainty or skepticism prevails, right? So, for example, okay, this will probably give you a sort of sense of the spectrum, right? So Maॻāzī says there is no reason to reject a priori the claim of the common link that he receives the tradition or the information on which it is based from the person he names, okay? And then he also says it is possible that common links were able to at least partly remember the person from whom they heard something concerning a tabi', sahabi, or the prophet, or that they wrote down the names of their informants together with the information received from them. But then Maॻāzī also says, and now we begin to slide towards sort of skepticism, the fact that we cannot prove that the common link really received the tradition from the person he names as his informant does not necessarily mean that he invented it. In order to decide whether a common link may be a transmitter or collector, we need evidence. If there is no positive evidence available, we should refrain from making a judgment. So Maॻāzī here is saying, actually, it could be a genuine transmitter, could be falsely ascribing. It's hard to tell. Schuler says, in regards to a particular case of Urwa, he says, what about Urwa's own sources? The verification becomes impossible at this stage. Likewise, Stein-Aerts says, the single strand from the Prophet, and he's talking about a particular case, the single strand from the Prophet to Ubaydullah is difficult, if not impossible, to verify. So the idea here is that behind the common link, from the common link backwards to the Prophet, this single strand is difficult, if not impossible, to verify. Shoemaker says an inherent skepticism pertains to the list of transmitters preceding the common link. And finally, Pavlovich says there is doubt about the authenticity of single-strand isnads covering the entire first century AH. So the idea here is that there's a debate here about whether the common link is a genuine transmitter or, a false transmitter. But in general, it's hard to know. And so there's a general kind of caution, skepticism in the sense of not just accepting the ascription at face value, I would say, across the scholarship. So these are the sort of major disagreements. Okay, so next we have the Isnād-Cum-Matn Analysis. That just means analyzing both the isnad and the matan, or the isnad with the matan. The isnad alongside the matan. And there are two versions of the Isnād-Cum-Matn Analysis. The first version, which was notably articulated by Harold Maॻāzī, for example. I mean, there are other early scholars, but the most notable practitioners are Maॻāzī, Schuler, and Gorka. So the first version, which was articulated, for example, by Maॻāzī, is a kind of appeal to the absence of elements. So the idea is, let's say there are two people and they transmit from a common source. They transmit the same hadith from a common source, but there are differences in their hadiths. one hadith has an element or a detail that is not present in the other. So Matzke says, look, if this other had actually borrowed and received the hadith, from the other, then they would have inherited the element of the detail, right? So the fact that actually they don't have that means they must have got it from a different source, from a common source with the one that has the addition. See what I'm saying? So he says, look, so it's sort of like this appeal to the absence of presence of key content, right? And so he says, look, when we look at the isnads and it says both of them got it from a common source, textually, this one doesn't have these elements in this one, so it must have got it from a common source, which is depicted in the isnads. So it actually comes from a common source, right? This is sort of the way that Matzke is approaching this. I personally don't accept this version of the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis, at least for the early period. Maybe this works later on when everything is being transmitted quite reliably, and so people, you would expect people to retain key details and so on. They got it from a common source and so on, from each other or whatever. But for the early period, the early period, there's all this sort of people are transmitting from memory, and clearly it's not very reliable memory. There's all this, variation and additions and reworkings and paraphrases and so on and so forth. So it seems like, easily someone could just forget an element when they, or whatever, in the process of paraphrasing and memory and so on. So I think this is not, for the early period, this is a lot more questionable. Another thing is just that it could just simply be the case that the, Matzke wants to say, oh, okay, so we have an added element in this version as opposed to this version, right? So then where did the added element come from? Well, either this transmitter has added it into the version, or the common source has added it. So in other words, the common source transmitted it one way and then changed something and then transmitted it another way, right? Or this person over here has added something into the material. But if that's the case, why couldn't this person down here, have just transmitted it himself one way, and then that version was borrowed by someone else, and then subsequently he added it in? In other words, the kind of variation that Matzke thinks is happening from the common link to the partial common link could easily just be happening between partial common links, right? There's no reason to think, so it isn't necessary to posit, an earlier common source. It might just be that one person, is citing an earlier source, but they transmit it two different ways. One of those ways is received by another person, and then they falsely cite the same common source, right? So there are easy ways around this sort of, reasoning. If you think that like things like tadlis, where people sort of omit the source that they received a hadith from, is common, then this is the sort of thing that you would expect to see, especially if people are often paraphrasing and reworking material in successive, retellings. So I think that, especially for the early period, I think that what Matzke's argumentation here makes sense for textual criticism. It makes sense when you're looking at written transmission. You would expect all these details to accrue and so on. And in general, I think details do accrue. But the point is that there are easy ways in which you could have this sort of thing being the result of borrowing, rather than common ancestry, where there's elements are missing in one version but are present in another, but actually, they don't derive from a common source. Okay, this is a little complicated, but just to give a bit of a sense for why I sort of don't accept version number one. Version number two is the version that I use, and this version says, okay, let's look at hadith. What do we find? We find in the isnads, very frequently for any given hadith, there's many versions, and they will converge in their isnads on commonly cited figures, right? And often you'll have, as I mentioned before, you'll have these clusters converging on partial common links, and then each of those partial common links will converge in turn on an ultimate common link, right? What you find over and over again is that in the matns, textually, the versions attributed to the partial common links are more similar to each other than they are to the others, right? So all the versions attributed to one partial common link are going to be much more similar to each other. And then all the versions attributed to another partial common link are going to be much more similar to each other. They form distinctive sub-traditions. And then in turn, all of the ascriptions as a whole to the common link are going to be more similar to each other than all of them are to all the descriptions to another common link on the same topic, right? So you often find that within a broad sort of topic, there are sort of multiple common links, right? So you'll have a general sort of matn cluster, right? A cluster of material on a common topic. And then you'll have, multiple common links, and each common link's ascribed material is internally more similar, usually or often, than to the other common links, right? So we have a recurring correlations between particular elements, wordings, features in the matn on the one hand, and in the common sources cited in the isnads on the other, right? So what explains this? What's going on? There's a simple explanation. People are accurately preserving to a degree. Things are changing. There's lots of variation, rewordings, interpolations, yes. But to a certain extent, people are accurately preserving the original wording, the distinctive wording, formulation of the common link. And the alterations made to that by the partial common link. So over time, transmission is becoming more and more reliable. And so, the basic gist of the common link is preserved, and the respective alterations of the partial common links are also being preserved. And not only are these sort of textual variations being preserved, but also from whom people receive the material is also being preserved as the material is being transmitted. So the isnads, in a sense, are genuine, right? Material is changing. Things are being added. So I don't want to say they're accurate or reliable per se, right? That would probably be misleading. But material is being genuinely preserved from the sources. In conjunction with, things are being paraphrased and altered, but it's decreasing over time. So changes are being preserved, right? And that explains the pattern. That explains why the descriptions of the partial common link are more similar, because they've all preserved accurately, more or less, the distinctive rewording of the partial common link. And it also explains why all the partial common links generally will embody some underlying material that's more similar from the common link than other material. Because again, they in turn, they've made alterations, they have accurately preserved something from the source and from whom they got it. They got it from that source. And that explains this pattern of evidence, which we find all across the Hadith corpus. I find this constantly. Other scholars have found this constantly. Now, there's a further argument to justify this, right? Because the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis is positing what explains the pattern, approximately genuine transmission. But as it turns out, if that's true, what this means is that from the common links to the partial common links, transmission was still extremely paraphrastic, kind of sloppy. A lot elements are being added, omitted. It's pretty substantial variation that typically is occurring from the common link to the partial common links. However, from the partial common links onwards, things are much more accurately preserved, right? And you have much less variation. So you can clearly see, if this is true, we have initial higher rate of variation and then a lower rate of variation. We can see a clear decline in variation over time. So the question is, what would explain that? It would have to be that transmission is becoming more reliable. Why is transmission becoming more reliable? Well, one obvious explanation would be people more and more are using written sources. So then we turn to the scholarship on the rise of writing. And scholars like Michael Cook and Gregor Schuler and Christopher Melcher have looked at these conflicting reports about writing, and using principles like parsimony and so on, they organize these reports into a chronology. And the basic outcome of the chronology is, from around the year 800 onwards, writing predominates. The writing down of hadith is now basically uncontroversial, and everyone is doing it to varying degrees, right? And so when we look at the variation that I mentioned, in terms of the absolute chronology, most of the common links are operating in the 8th century CE. The partial common links are operating usually at the end of the 8th century. And then their students would be the generation that are usually now just everyone's writing stuff down. So it approximately lines up with the rise of writing. The drop in the variation in transmission on the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis and what's being posited as genuine transmission on the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis lines up with the rise of writing, right? And it lines up with something else as well, which is the transition in most isnads from an to akhbarana, haddathana, right? In the isnads, people will quote within a quote, like, so-and-so related to me, quote, so-and-so related to me, quote. And then you hit a certain point where now it's just this one person all the way down saying, it's one narrator now saying, oh, so-and-so narrated from me, from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so. And now it's just this one person being quoted all the way back, right? From from so-and-so, from so-and-so. The point at which most isnads switch, if you line them all up and you see how far back is it people saying akhbarana or whatever, hadathana, so-and-so related to me, so-and-so related to us, versus generic from, approximately lines up with this as well. Approximately. In general, around the same time period. So this is a clear shift. Now, this is two ways of interpreting this. Either people are now trying to actually quote verbatim what the previous person said, which kicks in around this time, or people are compensating for the fact that everything is being written down by saying, okay, yeah, everything's being written down, but I actually was present when he said the words as well, right? So it either directly is just people are trying to be more precise, or it indirectly attests again to the predomination of writing. Either way, there's a clear correlation between the chronology of variation that is generated by positing genuine transmission through the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis as an explanation for the variation and so on, and independently the chronology of the rise of writing. It lines up. This is a really striking confirmation of the genuineness of the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis as a posit for a general explanation of the evidence overall, right? This is basically a slam dunk, right? For me, this is the decisive blow against skeptics of the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. And there's one or two scholars who remain sort of skeptical, but one by one they're falling. Herbert Berg, for example, held out for a long time. Now he's also sort of seems to agree that Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis is viable. So, okay. This is just a general summary of Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. So I've recorded a separate, short sort of demonstration of the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis, showing how we, collate the texts and compare them and so on, which will be available in a link below or in some sort of supplementary presentation. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. Next, we have the utility of the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. Why do this? Firstly, it allows us to reconstruct earlier redactions and texts. Why does this matter? If you pick up any given hadith, you have no way of knowing if this is reflective of the earliest version of the material, or if this is some sort of later alteration, interpolation, rewording. If you're relying on a particular detail in a hadith, if there's a hadith that mentions some important detail, and you are relying on that detail, for all you know, that detail could be a later addition by a partial common link, for example. That could just be an interpolation. That could be some later figures, some tradent speculation, guesswork, whatever, right? So it's important that we, as much as possible, have the original version of the hadith. And so the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis allows us to do that. It allows us to reconstruct. When we are comparing and correlating, it allows us to see, okay, these elements are only from this partial common link, right? This has been added in by the partial common link. But this set of elements is present in all of them. So that's clearly part of the original. And there are other principles as well, certain textual critical principles as well. The more difficult reading is probably the original. Criterion of dissimilarity, if it's ascribed, one version ascribes it back to an earlier source, another version only cites a later source. The version citing a later source is probably the original, because it's more likely that someone would project it back to an earlier source than someone would take an ascription to an earlier source and reduce it back to just being an ascription to a later source, right? Criterion of dissimilarity. There are various principles, but the point is we can reconstruct the common links redaction, and that allows you to, have to be as close as possible, as far as it's available and discernible in the extant material, to the original version of the hadith, right? To whatever its earliest form was. This allows you not to accidentally be relying upon later additions and interpolations and so on and so forth. That's the first thing that, the first utility of the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. Second is that we can date material. If I can trace a redaction of some material back to a common link, what that means is that this material is at least as early as the time of that common link, right? It has to predate their death, probably by some time, but we don't know exactly how much time, but still, it provides a sort of latest possible point of origin for the material. So we can date material earlier than, we don't just have to pick up a hadith book and, it's the earliest book it's attested in is, whatever, Al-Bukhari. Okay, we don't know how. No, we can go earlier. We can date material earlier, often to to at some point in the 8th century, or even earlier. Sometimes we can reach back to someone like Urwa ibn Zubair or follower. It's quite early, right? So that's the second utility. And the third thing is that, in the case especially of like jurists and also, for example, of Shi'i imams, we can actually reconstruct their positions, their opinions. We can reach, Ja'far as-Sadiq. We can reach Ata or Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri. We can reconstruct their, some of these hadiths aren't transmissions from early authorities. They're just the opinions and precedents of these figures. So we can actually, so remember I was talking about the regional traditions, the Meccan tradition, the Kufan tradition, the Medina. We can actually reconstruct the opinions of some of these figures using Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. Like Joseph Schacht generally was very skeptical of ascriptions to followers, but I think actually in many cases we can trace some of these legal positions back to those followers, right? All the way back, as early as the followers, right? So I think that's very useful, especially for the reconstruction of early, Islamic law and doctrine and so on. I think that's incredibly useful. Or for example, the debates about, what was the position of, Ja'far as-Sadiq? What was he teaching? Well, this can answer that question. We can correlate material specifically with him and trace it back to him. That can answer that question. What was his actual teaching? And so on and so forth. So there's actually, this is incredibly useful in my opinion. And this can be done in the domain of historical narratives. This can be done for legal doctrines. This can be done for theological doctrines. If you're trying to reconstruct how early did people believe something about the Prophet, this is how we can do it. How early was a legal position present? We can do this. How early was a certain theological position? We can do. We can reach back earlier. Again, there's a bit of a limit sometimes, right? Once you hit the common link, well, that's the limit, right? In principle, there are ways to reach beyond actually other methods, but it's complicated. Like if you have multiple common links, and they aren't citing a common source, but they all have the same doctrine, and you can reasonably infer that the material is a bit earlier than the common links, for example. So how far back, question mark. But still, it allows us to reach back into the history of, Islamic historical narratives, legal doctrines, and theological doctrines. Incredibly useful, in my opinion. So next we have an intriguing question. Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis and proto-Sunni hadith criticism. Right. This is how similar are they? How different are they? An intriguing question. First of all, the similarities. Both the proto-Sunni hadith critics and Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis, they are comparing transmissions. It's true, right? The Sunni hadith critics will compare different versions of a hadith to try and detect, for example, subtle defects, ilal, right? These subtle defects in the hadith. Has someone raised it back to the Prophet falsely? Has someone added in a key doctrinal statement that the others don't have, etc., right? And they will attribute errors, interpolations to specific traits, right? So they'll, look at, these ones go back to this figure. This figure is unreliable. He's the one who altered it, right? And so there's a bit of that does resemble Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis, but I think the resemblance is very superficial, and I think that honestly, it's like it's so superficial that you may as well also compare proto-Sunni hadith criticism to Schacht's analysis of hadith, right? Schacht is doing similar stuff. He's comparing transmissions, and so and he's detecting where in this line of tradition someone's raised it, but in this version it's unraised, and so on. This is the same, or pretty much the same level of similarity as Joseph Schacht, for example. So I don't think that is enough to say they were engaging in Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. And in fact, there are lots of clear differences. So first of all, the Proto-Sunni hadith critics, at least in the material that has survived, are extremely sporadic in identifying additions and changes. Like the amount of additions and changes. Let's just take actually the hadith that I studied, the thesis, my PhD thesis on the Aisha hadith, right? I found constant additions and changes in the material, constant, right? It's like numerous all across the material, a vast amount of interpolations, alterations, addition of elements, you name it. The amount of those that are actually discussed by the hadith critics is like almost none. Almost none of them are discussed, right? They identify only a tiny fraction. So immediately, Proto-Sunni hadith criticism comes across as extremely sporadic, in regards to this, right? They only identify a fraction of the material, right? The Gemara is nowhere near as systematic as the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. First difference. Secondly, the Proto-Sunni hadith critics, they have this system of, they have their reliable figures. They are reluctant to impugn these reliable figures. They will try, wherever possible, to cast blame for a problem in transmission on the less reliable figures. Even if there are multiple people who transmit something to a figure that they don't like, they would rather blame those multiple figures, if possible, than the common source for the material, right? And my example of that hadith from Sufyan al-Thawri, 10 transmissions from Sufyan, all of them rejected. Everyone, they blame all the unreliable people and so on. So this is another difference, is that there's this role of venerated figures, and exceptions are made for venerated figures. Not always. There are, even venerated figures will sometimes be blamed for an error, but usually it's going to be because there's other venerated figures who are contradicting them, for example, right? Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis doesn't make these exceptions. We don't make exceptions for ziyadat al-thiqa, other additions of reliable tradings and so on. This is another key difference. Another key difference is the Proto-Sunni hadith critics are not appealing to correlations. They aren't. The reasoning is completely different, right? That already, it's just they aren't doing a Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. They aren't correlating particular elements with particular tradings and so on. They're not doing anything like that, right? They have their alternative system of, is this person reliable? Okay, then we accept it, but then we compare transmissions, and if there's an important contradiction, we try to figure out based on who's more reliable and who's less reliable, who's responsible, and so on. This is a totally different kind of analysis. They also are not reconstructing texts. Another huge difference. We are reconstructing the redactions of partial common links and common links. There isn't anything even remotely like that in the material that I've looked at, right? I would, I'd be amazed if you could find a reconstruction of an text or a redaction in Proto-Sunni hadith scholarship. In fact, and this brings us to the last point, clearly there's a basic conceptual difference here. For the Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis, all the material is sort of fluid and evolving, right? Material is being changed. There are no accurate versions. It's not like, there's a sahih and there's a da'if. In a sense, it's all da'if, or maybe I should say it's all mudtarib. It's all sort of altered and muddled and so on. Like there are no reliable versions. There's just, all these different hadiths. They've all of them have changed in various ways, and we reconstruct from all of them an original that won't usually be identical to any given one, right? There is no reliable version. You see what I'm saying? But the hadith critics, they, I think in terms of reliable and unreliable versions, reliable and unreliable transmissions, right? This is a completely different way of conceptualizing, whereas we don't agree. So they'll say this one is sahih and this one is da'if. No, we say this part of this hadith is from the partial link, and this part, and also in this part and this part, not the version as a whole. See what I'm saying? So I think they generally think in terms of reliable and unreliable versions rather than of reconstructing elements and reconstructing the text. And that's a absolutely huge conceptual difference in the way that the material is being approached. So I think that the Proto-Sunni hadith critics are not engaging in Isnād-Cum-Matn analysis. The level of similarity is so generic that you could just also compare them to Yosef Schacht or Gautier Yoinbol as well. These other kinds of common link analyses, equally. And in fact, Eric Dickinson compares what they were doing to Schacht. So there you go. Okay, next we have authenticating hadith. Can we, in secular critical scholarship, is it possible to identify authentic content in hadith, so to speak? If so, what are some examples? So I don't think that we currently have any isnad-based criteria yet. We don't really use isnads to sort of authenticate hadith, which is obviously the huge difference between the secular critical approach and the traditional, for example, Sunni approach. But we do have other methods. So, for example, there is the criterion of embarrassment. The idea here is if the hadith has content that was embarrassing, then it's unlikely that people would have made it up. Therefore, it's probably not made up. Therefore, what explains it being preserved is that it's just genuine and people just happen to, to pass it on. No one would have actually actively created it. This is the criterion of embarrassment. This is a very difficult criterion to use, though, because it requires us to actually know what is embarrassing. And that's a tricky one. So, for example, the famous one is the satanic verses. People would appeal to that and say, oh, satanic verses, the prophet is made to accept these pagan goddesses, and then he later goes back on it. And this, goes against the doctrine of infallibility and so on. The problem with this is that actually, it looks like in the earlier period, there wasn't a doctrine of infallibility. And instead, these verses, the satanic verses story clearly is positive. The point of the story is that the Quran is perfectly preserved. People somehow, I don't know why people don't realize how the story ends. The story ends with, and then the satanic verses were chucked out. So the Quran is uniquely preserved. When the devil came along and tried to interpret the Quran like the other scriptures, he failed. That's the point of the story. So of course people would make this up. This makes the Quran look perfectly preserved, right? So the criterion of embarrassment is very dangerous, right? And so it's hard to apply it because we often don't know what was actually embarrassing. That's the first method. Next, we have the criterion of dissimilarity. The idea here is just that based on people's interests and context and milieu, there's predictable ways that we would expect them to conceptualize and create material, right? And so, for example, the Constitution of Medina. Constitution of Medina, which is this early treaty between the Prophet and the people of Medina, there's an overwhelming consensus in secular critical scholarship that this is a genuine document. This is a genuine document that is being preserved in the Islamic sources. Why? Because, first of all, the Arabic is super archaic and difficult to understand. Even in the Abbasid period, there are grammarians who have to sort of discuss and try and explain, some of the elements, right? So it couldn't have been created later on. People wouldn't have created it. Like we see what happens in Hadith. People update and reword Hadith over time, so you just expect it to be the wording, if it was created later, to reflect the later wording, as we sort of have happening with Hadith, for example, but we don't. So that's one thing. Another thing is just that it depicts Jews as being part of the Ummah. They have a separate deen, but they're part of the Ummah. This sort of goes against later sort of sectarian conceptualizations of Islam. So we wouldn't expect it to be created later on. It fits an earlier context better, for example. And there are other things like that. So this is the criterion of dissimilarity. The idea is that it goes against the grain, so it goes against later expectations and assumptions and so on. So it's unlikely that it was created later, so it's probably then created earlier. Kroner also argues for this for early hadiths about the hijrah. There is an archaic notion of hijrah as this continuous process that you're constantly migrating in the path of God, right? Not just this single one event from Makkah to Medina. That clearly goes against the later sort of classical agreement and conception of hijrah, so it's probably much earlier. And so we can infer that this material, this archaic notion of hijrah, is very early, for example. So that's criterion of dissimilarity. Next, we have transsectarian agreement. This one is tricky for the reason I already mentioned. Polemical borrowings can create a false consensus. But there are versions of this that I think are strong. Like maybe this is sliding into the criterion of embarrassment here. But why would why, this is Donna's argument about the Quran, for example, why would the Khawarij have accepted, a later false narrative that the Quran is from Uthman? It seems incredibly unlikely, right? The same for the Shia. They all hate Uthman. So, it's hard, so when all of them are agreeing, the Khawarij, the Shia, early Sunnis, etc., they all agree that the Quran is from Uthman. He's the one who sort of canonized the Quran. Okay, then probably what explains those stories is that there's this genuine early memory. Right? So that's a case, I think, where transsectarian agreement is a strong argument, right, for showing that this is a genuine memory that is embodied in many hadiths, for example, even if the details of the hadiths, I think, are inauthentic, etc. Next, we have non-Muslim corroboration. So this is, early non-Muslim sources mention various things about the Prophet, like that he was an Abrahamic monotheist, he's in Arabia, he has an emphasis on Moses, he forbids drinking alcohol, etc., right? So we have like an early Armenian source from the 660s that's saying this. And so now I don't think there's an independent Christian memory of Muhammad. I think they're getting it from early Muslims. But it shows us that, within just like a few decades of the death of the Prophet, these ideas that we may find in later hadiths were already present. So that material derives from a genuine, continuous, passed on tradition all the way back to very, very early on. So that we can use non-Muslim sources to sort of triangulate how early some ideas and perspectives were. Another sort of way of evaluating hadith and trying to authenticate hadith is archaeological corroboration. So the key thing here is inscriptions of, for example, names. So in some cases, I think it's ambiguous, but in other cases, there are names that are very like particular sequences of names that show up in an inscription and then also show up in a later source. And if there's like several names in a row, it becomes very unlikely that this is a coincidence. Or if there's like a particular constellation of names together and it's like father and multiple sons and it matches perfectly with a certain person in a certain place depicted in a later literary source, we probably have a match here, right? And so this shows us that people are able to accurately remember at least, these figures, these people, for example, right? So this sort of genealogy and this sort of information can be verified through all this new boom in archaeological material. Another thing that some scholars have argued is, for example, that the genealogy, at least for major figures, in general, the genealogical information creates a coherent network, coherent family networks. And if people later on are just randomly sort of creating stuff and then building on each other, it would be much harder for sort of just a coherent family network to emerge. So this is an argument that, there's just a genuine memory of an actual set of family relations here in the genealogical material. Next, we have, finally, we have conforming to established background knowledge. So this is just the most notable example of this would be, for example, Kroner's nativist prophet thesis. So the idea here is that when we look at, similar kinds of situations to Arabia on the eve of Islam, we often find people who look exactly like Muhammad, right? Fulfilling a similar kind of social function with a similar kind of situation. These sort of nativist prophets, for example, combining the religion of imperial dominators, foreign dominators who are coming in and dominating this sort of underdeveloped society that lacks conventional means of resistance, combining that with local traditions and sort of galvanizing resistance through a charismatic figure, right? So we find this again and again around the world in those kinds of situations. And then we look at early Islam and we can see something similar going on there. It conforms to our established background knowledge on the sort of thing that's going on in these kinds of situations. That's a reason to accept the material that's depicting that situation with the Prophet, for example. Now, there's a danger here. We don't want to anachronistically impose models. So famously, William Montgomery Watt is a Christian social reformer, right? And he depicts Muhammad as basically a social reformer, most interested in social justice. He's clearly reflecting Watt's own interests, right? He has a model that he's anachronistically projecting onto the material. So you have to be careful with this sort of thing. But I think that the nativist prophet model is a very strong one, is widely corroborated in other examples. So I think that's, but there's a danger there. So these are some of the ways that we can sort of authenticate hadith. And so I do think, in my personal opinion, I think a basic gist in the Islamic sources is probably accurate. The problem is just the details. Although, again, there is the danger. I mentioned the Medinan bottleneck. And if all the material is coming from storytellers, it's, there's a big danger here of false corroboration and false consensus. But I do think that a lot of the gist is basically accurate. And I think a lot of scholars think that as well. So these are some of the ways that we can establish that. Okay, next we have, who are the important or leading scholars in the field of Hadith studies and what are their works? So there are many scholars. This is just some of the major contributions on, for example, the development of Hadith as a genre and corpus, right? So I'm trying to narrow the question here. And this is post-World War II. I would say that these are some of the major scholars that sort of spring to mind for me. So we have, well, I can't go into detail because I know we're sort of short on time here, but it's Schacht, Abbott, Adami, Note, Yoimbol, Krona, Donna, Motsky, Shula, Gurka, Shoemaker, Pavlovich, Yanagahashi, Anthony, Ayertz, Sadachi, Ruhi. I would say these are the sort of the major scholars. And some of them are talking about hadith in general. Some of them are focused on legal hadith. Some are focused on biographical hadith. So there's a bit of, some on exegetical hadith. There's a bit of difference here. But these are the scholars who these are the major contributions to the development of hadith, I would say. As for the debates about dating hadith, I would say that these are probably the major scholars, to look to see the debates about, can we trust hadith, how can we date hadith, etc. And so we have Schacht, Kramers, Van Es, Cook, Yoimbol, Adami, Krona, Motsky, Kelder, Schuler, Berg, Schneider, Melchert, Gurka, Sadachi, Brown, Reinhardt, Shoemaker, Gledhill, and Pavlovich. And so, if you want to get a sense of all the debates, these are the sort of the scholars I would say to look to. But these are only for major works. I mean, there are other scholars as well, articles and so on. Mitte, for example, Burkhoff, Van der Voort, for example, Ihsan Ruhi, Steen Ayertz. I mean, there are other scholars as well. So it's hard to give a full list because there are always more scholars you can look at. But these are some of the major works, at least, the figures who have produced major works to do with this debate. Okay, so finally, useful online resources. Firstly, for finding hadith and for finding different versions of hadith, I mean, the obvious ones would be sunnah.com, Islam, which is just mostly confined to the Sunni canon, but it's just quick and easy. Also, Islam Web, Shia Online Library, especially obviously for Shi'i sources, although they also have other Sunni collections in there, and of course Shamala. You can find all these databases online. For finding tradents, I mean, there's Shamala. If you search in the Shamala library and you search for, particularly in the biographical dictionaries and so on, that's one way of finding them. But also a really easy way is using the hadithtransmitters.halromani.com. Incredibly useful just to quickly find the people, and then if you want to actually find the proper source, then you can use that to find the sources to then go and look at, for example. And finally, we have this incredibly useful program, app.diagrams.net, or also draw.io. It's the same program, and this is what I use to create hadith diagrams, and I highly recommend it. And so I think that's it. So I guess I'll stop sharing my screen now. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Little just sat here for, a long time going through all this, and I'm incredibly grateful. Doctor, forgive me if you can hear my kids shouting in the background.
No, it's fine. But look, let me just say that I love hadith and I love talking about hadith. So, it's not in any way a problem or anything like that. If anything, I'm sort of, I thank you for having the patience to sit through, my endless rambling. But I love talking about it, so it's no problem at all.
Excellent. Before we conclude, I was hoping that you could tell us something about your ongoing research, things you have in the pipeline.
Yeah. Okay. Many things. Right now, I'm particularly doing a lot of research trying to figure out the specifics of proto-Sunni hadith criticism. So I have a study on this hadith about Baghdad that I mentioned in the earlier on. I gave the little presentation on that. So I'm currently writing an article on that, trying to use that as sort of a way to analyze the workings of proto-Sunni hadith criticism. Also currently working on an article about intuition, the role of intuition in proto-Sunni hadith criticism. So that's one area. I'm also extremely interested in the history of the Quran, and I'm interested in sort of analyzing all of the hadiths, with Isnād-Cum-Matn Analysis, form criticism, geographical analysis. I'm looking at every single hadith to do with the collection and canonization of the Quran. And that's, and I have arguments based on purely intra-hadith. Even if the hadith are fabricated intra-hadith grounds, I still think we can argue for the Uthmanic recension as being genuine historical memory, which I'm very excited about. Sort of this research sort of complements all the manuscript and stematic arguments that are also out there. And other than that, I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff. I'm interested in, certain sort of legal debates and so on. But yeah, I guess those are probably the main things.
Understood. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to conclude the episode.
Thank you very much.